Ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to recessions, it is never a matter of if, but it is a matter of when. Because the truth about recessions is that they are just a cyclical part of our economic system. I mean, since the Great Depression in the 1930s, there have been 14 recessions, which is about one recession every 6 years. And I think that the question on many people's minds right now is, when is the next recession? Well, I think that what we have learned in the past few years with all these experts predicting when the next Great Recession will be is that nobody knows. Nobody knows when the next recession will happen. However, in order to know if we're nearing a recession, we can look back on past recessions and find common themes that ultimately triggered the recession. And by seeing these themes, we can avoid being victim to the next Great Recession. And so in this video, I want to talk about 7 things that often happen before a recession that will most likely trigger the next Great Recession. And the first thing is a high period. When we look at recessions, oftentimes before they happen, there is this high period where everything is going good and everyone is enjoying life. For example, when we look at the Great Depression in the 1930s, before it happened, there was this high period called the Roaring '20s. And in the Roaring '20s, everything was going great. The future looked bright as World War I ended. Modern conveniences became available for the average person, and easy access to loans allowed people to enjoy life more. And ironically, it was this high period, it was the Roaring '20s, that was a huge factor that triggered the Great Depression, because so many people lost themselves to the good times, where they were living above their means, eventually realized they couldn't afford the lifestyle they created, and had to live in the other extreme of poverty. People who are affected the most during recessions are the people who get blinded by the good times, that they're unable to see that bad times will eventually come. And so in order to prepare for the next recession, it's important to not lose yourself to the good times and expect that the good times, the high periods of life, will eventually come to an end. Now, the second thing is the end of bad times. Now, it isn't just a high period that triggers a recession, but sometimes it can be the end of bad times that could also trigger a recession, because sometimes something like war is bad for humanity, but good for the economy. And some recessions can actually come from the end of bad times. For example, from the years 1939 to 1945, World War II was going on, and these were bad times for humanity. However, they were good times for the economy, because men were abroad fighting, jobs needed to be filled so women joined the workforce, and the government was spending more than ever on manufacturing. Although the war was going on and times were bad for humanity, it was actually pretty good for the economy. However, once the war ended, government spending went down, the GDP decreased, and jobs women took over during the war were replaced by men's, leaving many unemployed. And it created a short recession. And so recessions can also happen at the end of a bad period of time, because sometimes bad things can actually be good for the economy. Now, the third thing is speculation. Now, another common theme when you look at past recessions is that oftentimes before a recession happens, there's a lot of speculation going on, or guessing an outcome without clear evidence. And a great example of this was the dot-com bubble in 2000, where people were investing in all sorts of internet companies. People were just speculating that if something was in the internet, it had .com on it, that they were going to get a huge amount of returns. And because so many people were speculating, these stocks did increase. So much so that from the years 1995 to 2001, the NASDAQ increased by 526%. However, after so much time, these internet companies weren't producing any profits, and people started to realize that their stocks were overvalued. And then in 2002, the NASDAQ decreased by 77%, losing all of its gains, and over 400,000 IT jobs were lost, and we entered a recession. There's a quote by Warren Buffett that goes, "Be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful." Oftentimes what can trigger a recession is a lot of speculation going on in the market. A lot of people trying to get in on the action and making investments that don't make any sense. And so in order to avoid being victim to the next recession, be fearful when everyone else is greedy and don't fall for the hype. Now the fourth thing is irresponsible lending from banks. Another huge theme that you see when you look back on past recessions is banks lending out money to anybody willing to take it. And the best example of this was the 2008 housing crisis, where banks were giving out home loans to anybody who asks, regardless of if they could afford the payment. And they were doing this because for a while, banks were really cashing in. However, eventually people couldn't afford to repay their loans and the whole financial system collapsed. And you remember what happened after that? Millions of people lost their homes, jobs, and savings. And because our government serves corporations, Wall Street received billions of dollars of government bailouts. God forbid of the consequences if we decided to help people instead of corporations. But recessions often happen when banks are left unchecked, because when left unchecked, financial institutions often chase greed instead of focusing on common sense and the greater good. And so in order to avoid being victim to the next recession, don't allow banks to tell you how much you can borrow or spend and decide for yourself, because banks aren't looking out for your best interest. Now the fifth thing is irresponsible spending by individuals. Now, as I said, when we look back on the 2008 housing crisis, a huge thing that triggered it was irresponsible lending by banks. But it wasn't just the bank's fault, but it was also people's fault for being irresponsible and taking on loans they couldn't afford to create a lifestyle they could not sustain long term. Irresponsible lending by banks was one thing that triggered the recession, and it's important to note that another thing was irresponsible spending by individuals. The truth is, most of the time, when you look at a person who has a bunch of expensive material possessions and ask yourself, how can they afford this? The answer is debt. Recessions happen when people fund their lives with debt, when they get the car loan they can't afford, the home loan they can't afford, and max out all their credit cards. Because eventually, you gotta pay these things back, and if nobody could pay back their debt, then the entire system collapses. And so in order to avoid being victim to the next recession, don't go in a bunch of debt trying to keep up with the Joneses, and be responsible with your spending. And again, don't let banks tell you how much money you can spend. Now the sixth thing is unforeseen events. If you look back at past recessions, another common theme that can often trigger them is something that nobody expected, some unforeseen event. And if you remember, a great example of this happened a few years ago in 2020, where a virus called COVID-19 shut down the entire world. Businesses were forced to close their doors. The unemployment rate rose to 14.7%. And for years after, we had high inflation. I mean, if somebody told you that a virus was going to come in and shut down the entire world, you'd think they were crazy. But it happened, and the only person who knew was Bill Gates.
Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this.
And the world will never be the same, but it is these unforeseen events that often ruin people financially. I mean, even on a personal level, like a surprise medical expense, some car accident, or your company unexpectedly going under. Recessions are just bad things in general. Happen when people least expect it. Things happen every single day that have never happened before, and the people who are affected the most are the people who don't prepare for the unexpected in life. And so in order to avoid being a victim to the next recession, expect the unexpected, prepare when times are good, because times will eventually get bad and some unforeseen event will happen. Now the final thing is lack of preparation. In the beginning of this video, I explained that with recessions, it's never a matter of if, but it's a matter of when. Because recessions are just a cyclical part of our economic system, and you will experience many recessions in your lifetime. And the biggest financial mistake that you can make is solely focusing on the things out of your control, like recessions, market crashes, and world events. Because those things won't prepare you, and instead, we should focus on the things that are within our control, like budgeting, creating an emergency fund, and living below your means. Because those things will prepare you for a recession. Recessions hurt everyone, but the people who hurt the most are the people who don't prepare. The people who focus more on when it will happen instead of preparing for it to happen. Nobody knows when the next recession will happen, but if you take preventative steps to prepare for the next recession, it won't hurt you as much. And those are the 7 things that will trigger the next great recession. And with that, muchas gracias, que tengan un buen día, nos vemos chicos.